Hello everybody, so today we're going to be back with another song analysis, this time with the second song that did not win the Twitter poll by a very narrow margin. So without any further ado, let's just get straight into the song Against the Tide. It's going to be a lot to talk about today, so I do think it's going to take a while. So I'm not going to say it's short like last time. I don't know how long it's going to be based on how much I'm going to have to talk about, but I do think it's a lot. Let's get started.
As whispers ride the wind in my ear.
So this first line I do think is a bit of a reference, if you didn't know, to Cartethyia or Flagellus' sort of bout of kind of near insanity when they were trapped in the inverted tower. They had to listen to the whispers of Leviathan and their temptations, and they basically nearly went insane. You can kind of actually read the story to find that out. But the whispers riding the wind are kind of the whispers of Leviathan, kind of like trying to tempt her into the dark tide. And I have watched and kind of like went through the song a little bit before doing this video, so I'm a bit more prepared. One thing I will say right at the beginning, and it's going to be very important later on, is that times of day, so dusk, dawn, and night, are all very symbolic in this song as to kind of like when the dark tide is going to hit. So for instance, the night, which we will see later, is going to be referencing the onset of the dark tide, while dusk, because dusk is a period of the day before the night, is kind of like the very near onset of the dark tide. So when she says dusk has brought the dawn of my fears, what she's really saying is that essentially dusk, so when the dark tide is about to hit, has kind of like brought on her fears, essentially. So building off of basically kind of what was already said in the last kind of line, the gale that devours the heaven and light, the heaven and the light is essentially the sentinel, and the gale that devours this is Leviathan, who has kind of like almost eaten up the sentinel. And basically, when you kind of like go through Cartethyia's story, she's fighting back against the dark tide at the very dusk of the onset of the dark tide, when it's about to hit Renacita. And Flagellus is basically fighting back against it in the inverted tower, but she knows that she's fighting a losing battle. The night is about to come. The gale has already devoured the heaven and the light. Leviathan has already taken up the sentinel, and the dark tide is imminent. So this line, again, if you didn't know already, is going to be referencing the dark tide again. Enshrined in shadow is going to be an important line a bit later, when we talk about basically the dark tide as being iconic of night and darkness, and the tomb provides us a bit of imagery of a place which is connoted with death and ending. The tomb built of night, as we said before, times of day are very symbolic in the song. The night is essentially the onset of the dark tide, and the tomb built of night is basically kind of when the dark tide will sweep over Renacita.
Strike my blade in rhythm with the storm.
And this line, if you have read through Cartethia's background stories by any chance, is a reference to when she was imprisoned, or well, she self-imprisoned herself within the inverted tower. And if you look at, for example, stories like Yet Within Solitude, it tells us this kind of narrative where she's fighting back against the dark tide, and she, quote-unquote, is using her sword to cut through the waves of dark tide, again and again. So when she strikes her blade in rhythm with the storm, she's basically using her blade to fight back and cut against the dark tide, which I actually think is displayed in a cutscene, but I'll post that when I'm editing this, but yeah.
Night is long. Daybreak comes at last. Cruel and harsh may reality be. It should not be cloaked in deceit. The truth will come to light. The people will rise!
So this line, entwined by fate, is essentially this reference that Cartethyia and her existence is essentially entwined by fate, because she's an artificial construct created by Leviathan in order to fulfill a purpose. So fundamentally, she's already been kind of like trapped by fate, and her whole intention, the whole purpose of her being, is to summon the Ashen Swarm, which is the Dark Tide, right?
Freedom must be wrought by the way.
So this line, freedom, if freedom must be wrought by the waves, is a little bit of a reference already to the first line of this stanza, where she says, strike my blade in rhythm with the storm, because it's another reference to her character story, Yet Within Solitude, where basically she must constantly fight against the whisperings of a Leviathan, which are physically manifested as waves, and she has to fight back, or fight back against it for her freedom. Thus, her freedom must be wrought by the waves.
Let this crown melt to dust and be carried away.
Very, very symbolic line. So if you have watched my Cartethyia video, you probably know what this is a reference to, but the crown is a reference to Cartethyia's thorn crown, which historically, in cases such as, for example, Jesus' crucifixion, when the Romans put a thorn crown on him, has been very symbolic of duty and suffering, and basically that's what Philidilus and Cartethyia do, because they're locked within the inverted tower, fighting against the Dark Tide completely alone, and the only way she's going to kind of essentially secure her freedom is to reject the crown and this duty that Leviathan and the Order has imposed upon her, let the crown melt to dust and be carried away. And this idea is actually expressed pretty well if you read the description of her signature weapon, which is called the Defier's Thorn, and that gives us further credence of this idea about how she's fated to do her duty of suffering. But essentially, when she finds her freedom, what she does is she recrafts or discards this crown in order to basically redefine her existence.
So let the gale become one with me.
So this line, I honestly think is not too symbolic of much. I think it's just a bit of a reference to the fact that she is very much connoted with the storm as an arrow resonator. But later on, one thing we're going to talk about is essentially this idea that this whole imagery of conjuring up Cartethyia as a storm or like a tempest actually kind of goes forward with this idea that she is a sort of storm that will blow back or hold back the Dark Tide, right? So she's this wind that pushes back the onset of Leviathan's Dark Tide, basically.
Follow me, the dawn will rise.
And if you were listening to when I said, for example, how within this song there's going to be a lot of references to times of day and how they are symbolic of either the near onset or the onset of the Dark Tide, what the dawn basically represents is sort of like this period or this time where she is like basically Cartethyia is fighting for a future which is free from the Dark Tide, or free from Leviathan's clutches, which is fighting for the dawn, basically.
As I kneel before their deity.
So if you played through the Renacida arc or the story, you probably know the deity is Leviathan, who has tricked the Order and the people of Renacida to worship it in the place of the Sentinel. And the people who kneel before their deity is basically kind of like people who believe in Leviathan, who is kind of like a wolf in sheep's clothing. And these blind masses who follow Leviathan and this religion are kind of like signing up for their doom, even if they don't really know it. They're accepting the status quo, basically. And Cartethyia is the only one who tries to fight against it because she knows the truth.
I will fight to turn the tide.
And what's very important in this line, kind of going off of the other line, is very importantly, she uses the word I, so she's alone in this fight. To turn the tide, of course, is this idea that she will turn back the Dark Tide, basically.
And rage again.
Very, very good line. I did not expect to see this line in a song like this, but you may know what this line means if you have watched my Chacona video. of all things. But this line is actually really good because it's a sort of reference, or almost a direct quotation from a very famous poem called "Do Not Go Gentle Into That Good Night." I think it was written in 1950, 1951 by this guy called Dylan Thomas. And one of the most famous lines, two lines of the poem, is essentially, "Do not go gentle into that good night, rage, rage against the dying of the light." And one thing you're going to see later on is that there's actually another reference to this poem. And this whole idea, like what Dylan Thomas is saying in the original, when he says to rage against the night, do not go gentle into that good night, is to basically never give up even if the situation seems completely hopeless, to keep on fighting on. And that is as an idea is perfect with this song and what Cartethyia basically does in the story, because even though Cartethyia is fighting a completely hopeless fight that she knows she's guaranteed to lose, she refuses to stop fighting. She refuses to let kind of like Leviathan and the Dark Tide win. So she will basically rage against the night. So two lines here actually, because they have like a sort of chorus like in the background. I don't do music, so like I don't really know what this is called, but actually two lines here. The air unfolds around me is, of course, I think a bit of an imagery of like the wind and the storm, about how Cartethyia is a sort of breeze or this wind, this gale that will push back the dark tide. And the tempest rife with light is very interesting, because when she says rife with light, she is essentially fighting for or in the name of the Sentinel, right? Even though she's created by Leviathan, she fights for the Sentinel. And this is going to be something that is kind of like going to be evolving throughout the rest of the stanza. So two lines here as well. I do want to focus on this line first though. I'll go and open up the skies is another way of actually saying what she will do is, it's like an alternate version of opening up the heavens, right? And opening up the heavens in itself is a very symbolic kind of like action, because it happens in the Bible. I'm pretty sure it happens when Jesus is crucified. But when you kind of take that biblical imagery, what it basically, not when Jesus is crucified, when Jesus is christened. Yeah, I'm not religious. I only read the Bible like years ago, so you'll have to forgive me. But basically, opening up the heaven, when you take that biblical imagery, essentially kind of is symbolic of righteousness and salvation. And what she will basically do is she will lead the people to a new dawn where she will bring salvation away from the dark tide of Leviathan. And this is something that will, as I said before, evolve throughout the stanza as we go through more and more of the lines and what they mean. But as you can see here as well, to rage against the night is again a reference to the previous line, to fight to the very end, from Dylan Thomas's poem. So hold on, let me just go back to this section, it's very important. So if you have watched my Cartethyia video, one thing you may remember is that Cartethyia's entire character, nearly one for one, is actually based off of Joan of Arc. There's so many references between the two that it's basically provable beyond doubt. But bellowing a fervent battle cry instantly reminded me of the role of Joan of Arc as a sort of like blessed maiden, same as Cartethyia, that leads armies into the battle. So when she bellows a fervent battle cry, leads from the front, finds their way out, kind of leads the people to a new dawn under the grace of the divine and heaven. It reminds me of this idea of, like, for example, Joan of Arc leading the French army during the siege of Orleans, for example, bellowing a fervent battle cry to essentially find their way out of this terrible night, this dusk that is about to unfold around them. So yeah, like kind of like the same thing as I said. So this is pretty common knowledge, I think, but if you didn't know already, the eye of the storm is the only place within kind of like a storm or a cyclone where like the sea or like everything is calm, right? So what it means when she says that she'll guide people through the eye of the storm is that she will basically lead from the front and be a guide through a terrible danger. So this line I was honestly, to be perfectly honest, was a bit confused on. What I do think is that perhaps the stars trapped above either are just the stars that she sees, or they actually represent the people of Renacita that she is trying to protect. Because the stars trapped above, the stars are kind of like, the people who are falsely believing in Leviathan, but they don't know that, right? So they're kind of trapped in their belief or deception. And if you're wondering why specifically I believed, like, my kind of take on the last line, it's mainly because of the line that follows after, which is this line. Their light is faint as the prayers I bear with love. So this is a reference actually to the fact that Leviathan utilize like dreams, hymns, and prayers. I think you can see this in one of her character stories, which I'll post later when I'm editing, where she, like, Leviathan weaponized the religious faith of the people of Renacita towards the Blessed Maiden to wear down Philadelis' spirit. And basically what happened is that she hated these prayers because, of course, they were channeling through Leviathan. But by the end of the story, I think, in another one of her character stories, she recognizes that these prayers, even if they were misdirected, were full of good intent. They really do believe in her and want the best for Renacita. So she kind of transitions and realizes that she actually really appreciates them, which is what it means when she says, the prayers I bear with love. So the shadows of the past basically represent the past actions. So for example, Leviathan merging with the Sentinel, or like whatever trippy shit that like Fenrico did to doom Renacita, that are now finding their grave. If you remember, the dark tide is being connoted not just with night in the song, but also with death, with the tomb enshrined in shadow. So finding the grave, finding the end, is when basically the actions of the past catch up to lead to the onset of the dark tide. So I think this song is actually not very difficult to understand. Basically what this means, the echoes of our souls, is like kind of like this hypothetical scenario when the dark tide eventually kind of comes and sinks everybody beneath its sort of like caress, basically. I will stand resolute on the edge with you. And this is introducing another very important kind of piece of symbolism. So if you remember, we already talked about how times of day, so for instance, dawn, night, and dusk represent kind of times of the dark tide. And if you remember with the whole symbolism of the dusk symbolizes a time of day which is right before the night, which represents a dark tide. So the dusk is essentially this kind of idea of people like Cartethyia and Rover are on the very edge of the imminent descent of the dark tide, and when she says she'll stand resolute on the edge, what she basically actually means is that it's not a physical edge, but a sort of conceptual one, which is the very edge of the dark tide, the very edge of the day, very edge of the night. And that is something which is referenced again in the next line, which is one of my favorite. So I really think it's such a shame that Against the Dying of Light and also the other line, which I think was Rage Against the Night, are kind of glossed over in the choreography of the song. Because again, if you couldn't tell, Against the Dying of the Light is another reference to Dylan Thomas's poem that we talked about previously. And the Dying of the Light, again, has a very symbolic kind of like parallel between the actual poem that Dylan Thomas wrote, which talks about this idea that you're like Cartethyia, is fighting against a hopeless and inevitable situation, and regardless of this, she fights on even if it seems impossible. So when she says, I bellow a vessel to light, this is a bit of a new line. And this is kind of like not so hard to understand. Cartethyia in herself rejects her duty of being a construct of Leviathan to be a vessel to light, to be kind of like someone who serves the will of Sentinel Imperator. And as a vessel of the light, we kind of combine a lot of imagery of, for example, of heaven, of light, of Joan of Arc, to kind of show that she is a knight that fights for the Sentinel, even if she, like, her very existence is predetermined on the complete opposite of this fact. This next stanza over here I really like because it kind of utilizes and summarizes a lot of the previous ideas that we've just talked about. So I'll just let it basically play completely out, and then we will talk about it a little bit. So as I talked about before, the edge symbolically basically represents the dusk, or the very time period right before the dark tide is about to hit. And that actually references quite a bit how Cartethyia and Philodilus waits within the inverted tower, fighting against the dark tide, in a battle that they know they can't win, hence the reference to Dylan Thomas's poem, waiting for someone to kill her, because that is her plan. That is the only way she can defeat the dark tide, is to die herself. And that's of course reinforced quite a bit. This connection between the edge and dusk is connected through the next line when she says, so when does a day wane? When does a day kind of like die out? It dies out during the dusk. So that again is a connection to parallel connection between these two ideas of being on the very edge, of being right before the descent of the dark tide, which is symbolized by the night. So very hard to listen to this line if you weren't reading lyrics, but this is a very, very symbolic kind of concept. You may know what this means if you have watched my Cartethyia video, but one of the most important pieces of symbolism with Cartethyia and Philodilus is the fleur-de-lis, which is what Philodilus is named after, by the way, which is a French heraldic symbol which depicts a yellow iris. And essentially it is symbolic of divine duty, of kind of like a upholding a sort of a kingship almost that is predisposed by divine right. And you can see the symbol all over kind of like Philodilus and Cartethyia's design. It's everywhere. And basically what it means here when the iris blooms is essentially this divine right, duty, and kind of morality blooming in the final line of the song. Basically just represents kind of like a small bud of hope, that even when the dark tide is looming, there is still a little bit of hope left, and you cling to that as the iris blooms. So the rest of the song actually should just be sort of repeated lines, so I think that we can just enjoy it and listen to the rest of the song. And I think one very interesting thing here, which is kind of sad, quite honestly, is this repetition of we'll find our way out, I'll find our way out. Kind of, I think, at least in my opinion, symbolizes this fact that even though the Cartethyia is fighting to find for a better future for everybody, in the end, I'll find our way out basically kind of reinforces this idea that in the end she's still fighting alone, right? The rest of the people that she's trying to save are completely blind to the fact that they are marching on their doom. So we'll find our way out, I'll find our way out, kind of presents this really sad dichotomy where she's fighting for everybody but fighting alone at the same time. And I think these two lines are quite significant as well, because these two lines, our world reforms at the world's edge, basically kind of symbolizes the climactic battle of the dark tide, that the whole world is going to change at the world's edge, right before the dark tide hits Renacita in this climactic battle. So yeah, that's it. One of my favorite songs from Wuthering Waves, quite honestly, because of the symbolism. Hopefully that didn't take too long. I don't know how long it is, I have to check after the video. But hopefully you guys enjoyed that. Hope you guys have a good rest of the day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.